Off the northern coast of Hispaniola, the sea breaks around a small, uneven stretch of land that appeared in early European charts, with shifting names and uncertain outlines, often marked only by passing references from sailors who described difficult landings, broken coastlines, and waters that seemed to change character without warning. Tortuga never entered colonial records as a stable possession in its earliest mentions, yet it continued to surface in fragmented reports where navigation, survival and conflict seemed to intersect in ways that were rarely fully explained. As these accounts are traced through naval logs, colonial correspondence, and scattered eyewitness descriptions, you are drawn into a layered record where certainty becomes difficult to hold in place, and where the same island appears repeatedly without ever being fully defined. What follows is not a single story of piracy or empire, but a convergence of evidence that reveals how control at sea fractured across time, leaving behind patterns that suggest something persistent was unfolding just beyond the reach of authority. The first shadows over Tortuga. Far out in the Caribbean Sea, just off the northern coast of Hispaniola, there is a small island that appears almost unremarkable at first glance, a fragment of land shaped by wind, salt, and centuries of isolation, where cliffs rise abruptly from the water and narrow inlets cut into the shoreline like forgotten passageways. Yet in the early colonial period, this same island would begin to draw attention not because of what it offered in comfort or abundance, but because of what it lacked: order, authority, and any lasting presence strong enough to define it. Tortuga Island existed in a space where the natural world dominated every horizon, and where the boundary between survival and abandonment often felt thin enough to disappear entirely. The Spanish Empire, which held dominant claims over much of Hispaniola after the early phases of European expansion in the Caribbean, paid little sustained attention to Tortuga in its earliest decades of awareness, not because the island was unknown, but because it was not immediately profitable or strategically essential compared to larger, richer territories nearby. This neglect would prove significant, as imperial focus remained fixed on mining centres, agricultural settlements and coastal strongholds, leaving smaller islands like Tortuga in a kind of administrative shadow where governance existed more in theory than in practice. Over time, this absence of structured control created a vacuum that was not immediately filled, but slowly absorbed by those already living at the edges of colonial order. Within that vacuum, the first semi-permanent presence on Tortuga was not an organised settlement in the traditional sense, but rather a shifting population of hunters, runaways, and mariners who moved between islands and coastlines with little allegiance to any single authority. Some were engaged in cattle hunting or subsistence survival along the margins of Hispaniola, others were sailors separated from their ships, and some were men who had already begun to distance themselves from the rigid structures of European maritime life. Their presence was not stable enough to form a colony, yet it was persistent enough to leave traces of human activity across an island that otherwise remained overwhelmingly defined by its natural isolation. As the 17th century progressed, the Western Caribbean began to see the emergence of buccaneering communities along the fringes of imperial control, particularly among those operating near the northern coasts of Hispaniola. These groups were initially tied to survival practices such as hunting wild cattle and smoking meat for trade, but their movements increasingly brought them into contact with Tortuga, where the lack of oversight allowed temporary camps to evolve into longer stays. The island's geography, with its hidden coves and difficult approaches by sea, made it an ideal refuge for those who preferred distance from colonial oversight, even when that distance came at the cost of stability or safety. It was during this period that French influence began to intersect with the island's developing identity, as buccaneers and displaced settlers associated with French interests in the region started to establish a more consistent presence on Tortuga's shores. Rather than a formal colony established through immediate state planning, Tortuga's early French connection grew through gradual occupation, reinforced by the practical needs of those who required a safe harbour outside Spanish-controlled zones. This process did not unfold in a single moment of founding, but through repeated returns, temporary settlements, and a slow accumulation of people who recognised that the island's greatest value lay in its distance from authority rather than its integration into it. What emerged from this pattern of occupation was not yet piracy in its fully defined historical form, but rather a loosely structured economy of survival that depended on trade, hunting, smuggling, and opportunistic exchange with passing ships. Goods moved through informal channels, and loyalty was often shaped less by nationality than by immediate necessity, creating a fluid social environment where agreements were temporary and enforcement depended more on reputation than law. In such conditions, the distinction between lawful trade and illicit activity became increasingly difficult to maintain, especially in a region where imperial boundaries were enforced unevenly and often inconsistently. Spanish authorities, when they did respond to activity around Tortuga, tended to do so in the form of sporadic military actions aimed at disrupting foreign presence rather than establishing continuous control. These interventions often succeeded in temporarily displacing settlers or destroying encampments, but they rarely resulted in lasting occupation, as the island's geography and the logistical demands of sustained enforcement made permanent control difficult to maintain. As a result, authority over Tortuga shifted repeatedly, not through formal governance, but through cycles of intrusion and withdrawal that left the island in a constant state of partial abandonment. Living conditions on Tortuga during these early decades were shaped as much by the environment as by human conflict. With limited access to fresh water, unpredictable weather patterns, and rugged terrain forcing its inhabitants to rely heavily on imported supplies or resources gathered from surrounding waters and neighbouring lands. Survival required adaptation rather than permanence, and the island rewarded those who could move quickly, endure uncertainty, and navigate a landscape where stability was never guaranteed for long. Even temporary settlements reflected this reality, often built with the expectation that they might soon be abandoned or destroyed. Over time, these conditions contributed to a gradual transformation in how Tortuga was perceived by those who passed through it or heard of it from afar, shifting from an overlooked landmass into a place associated with freedom from restriction, but also with instability and danger that could not easily be controlled. The absence of strong institutional presence allowed patterns of behaviour to develop that would have been impossible under tighter governance, and each wave of arrivals added another layer to a growing reputation that was still forming but already distinct from neighbouring territories under stricter colonial administration. By the middle decades of the century, the island's role as a refuge for displaced mariners and independent operators had begun to solidify, even as its political status remained uncertain and its population continued to fluctuate in response to external pressures. What had once been a marginal space on the edge of imperial maps was becoming a focal point for those who existed outside the conventional structures of empire, not yet defined by the full mythology of piracy, but already shaped by the conditions that would eventually make such a transformation possible. Carried by the Caribbean currents between unstable routes and shifting coastal approaches, what began to surface around Tortuga was not yet settlement or presence, but the quiet realization that even reaching its shores required navigating conditions that resisted certainty itself. The geography that refused control. Long before Tortuga became associated with shifting networks of maritime activity and fragmented authority, early navigators approaching the northern edge of Hispaniola encountered a coastline that did not conform to the expectations recorded in European charts of the period, where what should have been a predictable landfall often dissolved into irregular silhouettes of rock and vegetation that changed character depending on distance, tide, and approach angle. The island was not described in these early navigational accounts as a stable geographic reference point, but rather as a perimeter of uncertainty where attempts at precise landing frequently resulted in hesitation, redirection, or withdrawal, as if the environment itself resisted clear categorization within established maritime logic. Even in calm conditions, the waters surrounding the island were noted for unpredictable currents that complicated anchorage and made sustained positioning difficult, creating a persistent sense that control over movement in the area was never fully absolute. Hydrographic observations compiled in later maritime records describe a surrounding sea system shaped by intersecting currents flowing between the Windward Passage and adjacent channels, producing conditions where vessels attempting to maintain steady trajectories often experienced gradual drift without immediate awareness of deviation. These subtle displacements accumulated over time, altering approach paths in ways that were difficult to correct without repeated recalibration of course, and in some cases leading ships away from intended coastal entry points entirely. What made these conditions particularly significant was not their extremity, but their consistency, as similar reports emerged across different voyages conducted by independent crews who had no direct coordination with one another, yet described comparable difficulties in maintaining predictable navigation near the island's perimeter. The shoreline itself contributed to this instability through a combination of steep coastal gradients and irregular reef formations that disrupted shallow water movement and limited safe anchoring zones. Approaches that appeared viable from a distance often revealed hidden structural obstacles only at close range, forcing rapid adjustments in direction or depth that left little margin for error in vessels already constrained by wind and current conditions. In several documented accounts, captains noted that the visual clarity of the coastline did not correspond to its navigational accessibility, producing a recurring mismatch between perception and practical entry that increased the difficulty of establishing any sustained presence along the shore. This divergence between appearance and function became a defining characteristic of the island's maritime profile, reinforcing its reputation as a location that resisted straightforward occupation. Meteorological patterns in the wider Caribbean further intensified these challenges, as seasonal shifts in wind direction and storm formation frequently intersected with the island's coastal geography in ways that amplified existing navigational difficulties. Periods of relative calm were often followed by abrupt atmospheric changes that altered sea conditions without extended warning, compressing the window for safe passage or anchorage into narrow and unpredictable intervals. Maritime logs from multiple decades reflect repeated references to the difficulty of timing approach routes effectively, not due to a lack of knowledge, but because of the inherent variability in environmental conditions that could not be reliably standardized across voyages. Over time, this contributed to a broader operational uncertainty, in which even experienced navigators treated the region as requiring heightened caution, regardless of prior familiarity. Cartographic inconsistencies further complicated attempts to impose order on the island's geography, as maps produced in different ports often failed to align in their representation of coastline shape, orientation, or relative positioning within surrounding waters. These discrepancies were not solely the result of inaccurate measurement, but also of the unstable conditions under which data was gathered, where repeated attempts to chart the same region produced variations that resisted reconciliation into a single authoritative depiction. As a result, the island existed within European mapping systems less as a fixed entity and more as a fluctuating reference, whose boundaries and features shifted subtly between iterations, undermining the assumption that geography could be fully stabilized through documentation alone. Within this context, the difficulty of establishing reliable landing points became not only a navigational issue but also a structural limitation on sustained presence. Ships attempting to remain in proximity to the island faced ongoing challenges in maintaining position without drifting into less favorable waters, while those attempting repeated entry often had to rely on improvisation rather than fixed routes. The absence of stable natural harbours further reinforced this condition, limiting opportunities for long-term anchorage and requiring constant adaptation to changing environmental constraints. In practical terms, this meant that presence in the region was often temporary by necessity rather than design, shaped by the inability of physical geography to support extended continuity of occupation. Over time, these environmental conditions produced a form of geographic resistance that did not prevent access entirely, but consistently disrupted the ability to convert access into permanence. The island remained reachable, yet never fully containable within the expectations of maritime control systems that depended on predictability, repetition, and stable reference points. Even as navigational knowledge improved across the Caribbean, the specific conditions surrounding Tortuga retained a level of variability that continued to undermine efforts at standardization, ensuring that each approach required renewed assessment rather than reliance on established certainty. In this way, geography itself functioned not as a passive backdrop, but as an active constraint shaping the limits of human organization and control within the region. These same conditions that prevented sustained control would soon shape the kind of presence the island began to attract, as movement replaced permanence and instability became the foundation for a different form of survival along its shores. Outlaws of the Caribbean horizon. Scattered across the Caribbean's shifting maritime corridors, vessels that once followed predictable imperial routes began to move in patterns that no longer reflected control, but disruption. What had been established systems of passage shaped by colonial trade and naval oversight started to show irregularities that were not immediately understood as meaningful, yet they appeared often enough to leave traces in logs, correspondence, and navigational reports from multiple fleets operating in the region. Ships were still moving between ports, but the certainty of where they would end up or what they would encounter along the way was beginning to erode in subtle but persistent ways that suggested the wider maritime world was no longer as ordered as it once seemed. Breaking away from collapsing supply lines and fractured coastal labour systems, groups of hunters, sailors, and unaccounted mariners began appearing in waters where official records offered no explanation for their presence. Some were men who had been separated from their vessels during conflict or storms. Others came from inland coastal regions where economic pressure and instability had made traditional maritime work unreliable, and a portion existed outside any formal registry at all, moving between ships, ports, and temporary labour without fixed allegiance. Their movements were not coordinated in any centralised way, yet they shared a common condition of disconnection from the structures that once defined maritime employment and imperial oversight, drifting through a world where identity at sea was becoming increasingly difficult to verify or enforce. Drifting through shipping lanes that were increasingly under-enforced and inconsistently patrolled, individuals who no longer belonged to any recognised fleet or settlement found themselves moving freely through gaps left by imperial oversight. The Caribbean at this time was not a uniformly controlled space but a fragmented one, where the reach of Spain, France, England and the Netherlands overlapped unevenly, creating zones where enforcement was strong in one season and absent in the next. In these unstable corridors, movement itself became easier for those without formal ties, not because the region was safe, but because authority was inconsistent enough that absence often replaced confrontation, and the ocean between islands became less a governed space and more a shifting passage of opportunity and risk. Reappearing repeatedly in navigational accounts from different captains and competing powers, one small island began to register not as a destination of intent, but as a recurring point of unscheduled arrival. It was not marked by any major administrative importance in official colonial structures, yet its presence surfaced often enough in maritime experience that it could no longer be dismissed as incidental or accidental. Ships did not necessarily set out for it with purpose, but circumstances, weather systems, damaged hulls, pursuit from privateers or naval vessels, or simple miscalculation in unfamiliar waters seemed to steer them toward it with unsettling frequency, as though it occupied a position in the Caribbean that functioned outside planned movement, sitting at the edge of navigation rather than within it. That island, known as Tortuga, lay just off the northern coast of Hispaniola, separated by a narrow channel that could shift from calm passage to dangerous crossing depending on seasonal winds and ocean currents. Its coastline offered limited natural resources for sustained settlement, with rugged terrain and uneven access to fresh water, making it an unlikely candidate for any stable colonial centre. Yet its very lack of convenience became part of its significance, because what made it difficult for structured governance also made it accessible to those who had no interest in remaining under such governance in the first place. Over time, this contradiction between isolation and accessibility became central to how the island functioned within the broader Caribbean system. Colliding in makeshift encampments along the shoreline, these scattered arrivals began to form unstable interactions defined less by cooperation than by immediate necessity and shifting survival advantage. There was no shared authority to regulate exchange, no established governance to mediate disputes, and no consistent supply chain to stabilize daily life, leaving interactions to be shaped by improvisation and circumstance. Goods were traded, tools were exchanged, and labour was negotiated in temporary arrangements that could dissolve as quickly as they formed, producing an environment where social order existed only in brief and fragile intervals, dependent entirely on who was present at any given moment and what resources could be secured before conditions changed again. Within these early gatherings, the distinctions between lawful trade and illicit exchange began to blur in ways that were not immediately formalised but became increasingly visible in practice. Ships passing through the region sometimes exchanged goods informally to resupply or repair, while others engaged in transactions that existed outside official records entirely, particularly in areas where oversight was minimal or absent. The absence of consistent enforcement meant that behaviour was often defined less by legality and more by opportunity, and over time, the repetition of such interactions began to normalise practices that would have been considered irregular or unacceptable under stricter conditions of imperial control. Failing to stabilize under any single authority or shared system of conduct, the growing presence on the island remained fluid, reactive, and resistant to any lasting structure imposed from within or beyond it. Attempts at establishing continuity were constantly disrupted by the transient nature of arrivals, as individuals came and left without warning, carrying with them shifting expectations shaped by different ports, different ships, and different survival experiences. What emerged was not a society in the traditional sense, but a continuous state of adjustment, where order was always provisional and never guaranteed to persist beyond immediate necessity, and where even informal hierarchies struggled to maintain consistency for more than short periods of time. As these conditions continued to develop, the island began to function less as an isolated refuge and more as a point of convergence within a wider Caribbean pattern of displacement and maritime instability. It did not operate as a centre of authority, nor did it possess the infrastructure to support such a role. Yet its repeated appearance in the movements of ships and individuals gave it a presence that could not be ignored by those who navigated these waters regularly. What was forming there was still undefined, but it was no longer invisible, and its persistence suggested that it was becoming something that would continue to draw attention, whether it was understood or not. And as these patterns continued to intensify across both sea routes and shoreline encampments, it became increasingly clear that what was forming on Tortuga was no longer a scattered coincidence of survival, but something beginning to align itself into a more persistent and recognizable presence. Within that fragile and unsettled gathering, subtle divisions began to surface among those who remained, hinting that survival alone would no longer be enough to hold what was quietly beginning to take shape: the invisible economy of the Caribbean. Across the waters surrounding Tortuga and the wider Caribbean routes, patterns of exchange began to appear in maritime activity that were not formally recorded within colonial trade systems, yet consistently emerged through repeated movement of goods, provisions, and labour between ships operating outside regulated channels. What developed was not an officially recognised economy, but a distributed network of necessity-based transactions that functioned independently of imperial oversight, shaped entirely by immediate survival requirements and the limitations of formal supply structures at sea. Within this environment, value was not fixed by institutional authority, but determined through practical urgency, access, and the ability to sustain continued navigation across unstable maritime conditions. Maritime documentation from multiple colonial ports occasionally references inconsistencies in supply records, where ships were reported to have regained operational capacity without any verifiable access to sanctioned resupply points or dockyard intervention. These irregularities were often recorded as administrative anomalies, yet their recurrence across different fleets and regions suggests a broader pattern of unaccounted resource movement occurring outside official tracking systems. In several instances, vessels re-entering recorded routes displayed levels of provisioning that did not align with their documented supply history, indicating the presence of intermediary exchanges that were not captured within formal accounting frameworks. The movement of essential materials across the Caribbean followed pathways that were neither linear nor centrally organised, yet demonstrated repeated structural similarities in how goods were transferred between vessels, temporary coastal stops, and unregulated transfer points. These exchanges often occurred without formal identification or permanent record, relying instead on situational recognition and mutual understanding between participants operating under shared constraints. Over time, this created a form of logistical continuity that functioned independently of official trade routes, allowing maritime activity to persist even when conventional supply systems were disrupted or unavailable. Unlike regulated commerce, this system did not depend on stable institutions or enforceable contracts, but instead operated through repeated cycles of exchange that reinforced themselves through necessity. Trust was not formalized but reconstructed continuously through interaction, where recognition between participants was based on prior engagement and observed reliability rather than documented identity. This structure allowed the system to remain flexible under pressure, adapting to shifting conditions without requiring centralized coordination, while also remaining highly sensitive to disruption when key points of exchange were removed or altered. Naval and administrative reports occasionally note the reappearance of ships in active service, following periods of apparent depletion, without corresponding documentation of official resupply or repair, reinforcing the perception that alternative logistical systems were operating alongside formal infrastructure. While often treated individually as anomalies, the repetition of such cases across different regions and time periods suggests a broader underlying structure that was not easily captured through standard record-keeping practices. The inability of formal systems to fully account for these movements did not eliminate their existence, but instead highlighted the gap between documented trade and operational reality at sea. Within this framework, Tortuga began to function as one of several recurring points where these informal exchanges could occur with reduced risk of interception, not through formal designation, but through repeated use under conditions that limited external oversight. Its position within maritime routes, combined with environmental variability, created intervals of reduced control where exchanges could take place without sustained observation or enforcement. This did not establish the island as a centralized hub in formal terms, but it repeatedly placed it within the operational pathways of the invisible system, embedding it functionally within its structure. As these patterns persisted, maritime understanding of Caribbean activity gradually shifted from viewing supply irregularities as isolated incidents toward recognizing them as part of a broader and distributed system of exchange operating parallel to imperial commerce. This did not immediately alter administrative frameworks, but it introduced a growing awareness that control over maritime movement extended beyond official infrastructure into informal networks shaped by necessity and repetition. The economy that emerged in this space was not hidden in a single location, but embedded within the movement of ships themselves, sustained through continuous adaptation to conditions that formal systems could not fully regulate. Over time, the persistence of this distributed system would become inseparable from the operational realities of those who depended on it, shaping not only how resources moved across the Caribbean, but how relationships and dependencies formed within its unstable maritime environment. This gradual convergence of necessity-driven movement and repeated interaction would soon define the early foundations of organized presence around Tortuga, where informal alignment began taking shape among those operating at the edges of imperial reach, the Brotherhood of the Brethren. Reports that once treated the region as marginal or incidental began to register recurring irregularities in maritime movement and coastal activity, suggesting that what was unfolding could no longer be explained as an isolated or temporary disruption. The island, once absent from sustained administrative concern, now appeared indirectly through repeated anomalies that accumulated across separate accounts, creating a picture that was fragmented but increasingly difficult to ignore. In this slow shift of perception, instability that had remained contained for so long began to extend beyond the shoreline itself, reaching the attention of distant imperial observers who had previously dismissed it entirely. What mattered most at this stage was not any confirmed presence, but the persistence of patterns that refused to dissolve even when individual reports were separated by distance, time, and jurisdiction. What had begun as scattered and inconsistent mentions gradually formed into a pattern that could no longer be overlooked by those responsible for protecting colonial trade routes. Reports from different captains and regional authorities, once treated as unrelated disturbances, started to align in ways that suggested a persistent and unresolved presence in the same contested waters. Even without a centralized understanding of what was occurring, the accumulation of similar accounts created a pressure that demanded interpretation, forcing distant administrations to reassess areas they had long considered peripheral. The significance was not in a single event, but in the repetition of similar disruptions across time, each reinforcing the idea that something was consistently altering the expected behavior of maritime movement in that region. Over time, this repetition began to function as a kind of evidence in itself, where consistency replaced certainty as the basis for concern. As these accounts multiplied, the language used to describe the region shifted subtly from uncertainty to concern, reflecting a growing awareness that the instability was not fading, but persisting across time and distance. What had once been dismissed as environmental miscalculation or isolated maritime misfortune began to appear instead as something sustained, something that repeatedly resurfaced despite previous attempts to ignore or explain it away. This change in perception marked the first stage in which absence of control transformed into perceived threat, not because the nature of the island had changed, but because the consistency of irregularity could no longer be rationalized as coincidence. In official correspondence, ambiguity began to give way to cautious recognition that existing patrol patterns and territorial assumptions were no longer sufficient, forcing a gradual reconsideration of how order itself was being defined in those waters. Across administrative channels that rarely agreed on priority or urgency, the same location began to appear with increasing frequency, not as a destination, but as a point associated with irregularity and disruption. The consistency of these references, even when incomplete or fragmented, made it harder to treat the situation as incidental. In the absence of direct control over the island itself, attention shifted toward its effects on surrounding waters, where instability appeared to concentrate in ways that defied simple explanation. Ships passing through the region reported altered expectations of safety and supply, not because the waters themselves had changed, but because predictable support and oversight were no longer reliable in that corridor. The result was a gradual reorientation of attention, away from isolated incidents and toward the conditions that seemed to produce them repeatedly. What had once been a forgotten fragment of the Caribbean coastline now existed within imperial awareness, not as a defined possession, but as a persistent problem embedded in maritime movement. The lack of direct governance no longer meant neglect alone, but uncertainty about what form intervention would even take, as the situation did not resemble a conventional territorial dispute. Instead, it reflected a developing pattern of disorder that seemed to operate independently of the structures meant to contain it. The region was no longer being viewed through the lens of opportunity or expansion, but through the quieter and more uneasy recognition that absence of authority could produce its own form of continuity. In this sense, disorder was no longer treated as a breakdown of control, but as something that could sustain itself through repetition alone. The weight of these accumulated reports eventually forced a reconsideration of the region's status within broader colonial strategy, not because of its immediate value, but because of the instability it appeared to generate across multiple routes and settlements. What had once been outside the scope of attention was now becoming part of a wider calculation, where ignoring the pattern was no longer a viable option. In this shift, observation began to move toward intent, and intent toward response. Plans that had once focused on trade protection and territorial consolidation began to include references to disruption management, even when the source of that disruption remained only partially understood. The uncertainty itself became part of the operational problem, requiring action in the absence of complete clarity. Within this growing awareness, the island itself was no longer viewed as an isolated curiosity, but as a recurring point in a wider system of maritime unpredictability. Its significance was no longer tied to what it contained internally, but to what it appeared to produce externally across the movement of ships, goods, and people. Even in the absence of direct occupation or sustained presence, its influence was being measured indirectly through consequence, where patterns of disruption seemed to intensify around it, rather than away from it. This indirect visibility made it more difficult to dismiss, because it was no longer a place being described, it was a condition being recorded. The island had effectively shifted from geography into interpretation, existing as much in the language of reports as in the waters themselves. That emerging awareness remained unformed, existing only as scattered recognition within reports that had not yet been brought together into a single, coherent interpretation. Signals across the Atlantic. Dispersed administrative reports circulating between colonial offices began retaining small but repeated references to unusual maritime activity that, at first, carried no apparent connection across their separate origins. What made these references difficult to dismiss was not their individual content, but the way similar descriptions appeared independently within records that had no formal relationship to one another. Over time, the persistence of these small, irregular mentions created a subtle pressure within archival review processes, where isolated details began to accumulate into something that resisted simple categorization. The significance of these documents did not emerge immediately, but through gradual recognition that repetition across separation often indicated more than coincidence. Comparative review of correspondence from distant ports revealed subtle consistencies in phrasing that emerged independently within documents never intended to be interpreted alongside one another. Reports authored under different administrative conditions began using comparable language to describe disruptions, even when the writers had no shared directive or coordinated framework. This linguistic alignment did not suggest deliberate coordination, but it introduced an unexpected level of uniformity across otherwise disconnected accounts. As these similarities became more apparent, The assumption that each report represented an isolated observation began to weaken, replaced by a growing awareness that multiple observers were encountering variations of the same underlying phenomenon. Internal summaries produced within regional governance structures started noting overlapping descriptions of disturbances that could not be easily reconciled with isolated explanations previously used to categorize them. These summaries were not yet unified interpretations, but they reflected a growing discomfort with the adequacy of existing classifications. Events once attributed to ordinary maritime uncertainty or local instability began to appear in aggregated reviews as part of a broader pattern that resisted reduction to single causes. The challenge lay not in the absence of data, but in its repetition across different contexts, which made conventional explanatory frameworks increasingly insufficient. Cross-referencing of ship logs compiled across multiple jurisdictions gradually exposed recurring sequences of events that appeared too similar in structure to be treated as unrelated occurrences. Ships operating under different commands, routes, and timeframes recorded comparable disruptions in ways that suggested a shared pattern of maritime interference or coordination. While each log remained independently consistent, their collective alignment created a secondary layer of meaning that emerged only when they were examined together. This indirect coherence did not provide immediate answers, but it altered the interpretive weight of each individual record, transforming isolated entries into components of a larger, unresolved structure. Terminology used by naval administrators began shifting in small but noticeable ways, reflecting growing uncertainty about whether existing classification systems could still adequately describe what was being recorded. Words previously used to define isolated acts of piracy, weather-related disruption, or navigational error began appearing alongside qualifiers that indicated hesitation or reinterpretation. This gradual change in language signaled not a formal redefinition, but an internal struggle to maintain clarity in the face of persistent ambiguity. As the descriptive framework weakened, the gap between observation and interpretation widened, forcing greater reliance on inference rather than established categories. Accumulated intelligence from separate colonial networks increasingly positioned a single geographic reference within multiple unrelated accounts, creating an emerging point of interpretive convergence. This reference did not appear as a central focus in any single report, but its repeated emergence across different documents began to draw attention from analysts attempting to reconcile disparate sources. The island's name surfaced indirectly, often embedded within broader descriptions of maritime routes, disturbances, or logistical notes, yet its recurrence across contexts made it increasingly difficult to treat as incidental. Over time, this convergence of references began to suggest not a single event, but a recurring condition associated with a specific region. Higher-level correspondence within imperial governance structures began reflecting an emerging reluctance to dismiss patterns that persisted across reports originating from entirely disconnected sources. Discussions among administrative bodies shifted subtly, from questioning the validity of individual reports to examining the possibility that their similarities reflected an underlying system of activity. This shift did not yet produce consensus, but it marked a change in tone, where skepticism was gradually replaced by cautious recognition that repetition across distance might indicate structural coherence. The focus moved away from proving individual accuracy and toward understanding collective consistency. Strategic summaries compiled for senior colonial oversight started acknowledging that repeated alignment in independent observations could no longer be explained through chance or reporting error alone. These summaries did not offer definitive conclusions, but they emphasized the increasing difficulty of maintaining traditional interpretations in the face of persistent pattern repetition. The accumulated weight of similar accounts created an interpretive threshold beyond which dismissal became less defensible. As a result, analytical attention began to shift from validating reports to understanding what conditions could produce such consistent convergence across unrelated sources. Administrative evaluations prepared for policy-level consideration ultimately reframed the accumulated irregularities as indicators of a developing systemic condition, requiring formal response rather than continued observation. What had begun as scattered and ambiguous references was now being treated as evidence of a pattern significant enough to influence strategic decision-making. This reframing did not resolve uncertainty, but it altered its consequences, transforming uncertainty itself into a factor requiring operational consideration. In this way, recognition replaced dismissal, and interpretation began to move toward preparation for action. As these converging assessments moved beyond interpretation and into coordinated strategic planning, preparations began forming for a direct response that would soon be directed toward the source of the unfolding pattern. When intelligence failed to converge, across multiple colonial administrative centres spanning the Atlantic world, reports originating from Caribbean naval stations began accumulating in volumes that far exceeded the capacity of traditional interpretive systems. Yet these reports rarely resulted in a unified understanding of the maritime conditions they described. What emerged instead was a fragmented archive of partial observations, where similar incidents of disruption, interception, and irregular vessel movement were recorded independently without being reconciled into a coherent operational framework. Each administrative layer processed incoming information according to its own procedural standards, creating parallel interpretations of the same events that diverged further as they moved upward through bureaucratic channels. Communication delays between Caribbean outposts and European command structures introduced a temporal distortion that affected not only the speed of information transfer, but also its relevance by the time it reached decision-making authorities. By the time reports describing specific maritime incidents were reviewed in centralized offices, the conditions they referenced had often already shifted, been repeated elsewhere, or evolved into entirely new configurations that no longer matched the original descriptions. This lag produced a persistent mismatch between observation and response, where decisions were based on outdated interpretations of a rapidly changing environment that no longer reflected current conditions at sea. Compounding this delay was the absence of standardized reporting frameworks capable of translating localized naval encounters into consistent categories understood across different jurisdictions. Identical maritime events were frequently classified under differing operational definitions depending on the authority documenting them, resulting in a widening gap between recorded intelligence and actual conditions in the field. Encounters described as piracy in one report could appear as unauthorized privateering in another, while similar engagements were sometimes categorized as routine maritime disturbances, further obscuring any attempt at pattern recognition across regions. As these inconsistencies multiplied, intelligence systems began to function less as instruments of clarity and more as repositories of unresolved contradiction, where overlapping accounts existed without synthesis or resolution. The accumulation of reports did not produce greater understanding, but instead reinforced fragmentation, as each new layer of information added complexity without resolving existing discrepancies. Within this structure, the same maritime zones appeared repeatedly across documents, yet never in a unified context, preventing the formation of a stable operational picture that could guide coordinated response. Naval intelligence networks attempting to trace patterns of activity across the Caribbean encountered repeated instances where similar descriptions of coordinated raids, ship dispersals, and rapid withdrawals appeared across unrelated reports, yet could not be reliably linked to a single operational source. These recurring observations suggested a level of consistency in maritime behaviour, but the inability to connect them through shared classification or synchronized reporting prevented them from being interpreted as part of a unified system. As a result, what might have been recognized as structured activity remained dispersed across multiple interpretations that never fully converged. Within this environment, the distinction between verified intelligence and interpretive assumption became increasingly difficult to maintain, as reports were filtered through layers of uncertainty introduced by distance, delay, and administrative fragmentation. Information that originated as direct observation was repeatedly reframed through successive stages of reporting, each introducing subtle variations that altered its final interpretation. Over time, this process weakened the reliability of intelligence as a predictive tool, replacing operational clarity with layered ambiguity that resisted consolidation into actionable insight. Attempts to reconcile conflicting reports through centralized review processes failed to resolve these discrepancies, as the underlying issue was not a lack of data, but the structural incompatibility of the systems used to interpret it. Even when identical incidents were identified across multiple sources, differences in terminology, timing, and classification prevented consistent alignment between accounts. This created a condition in which recognition existed without convergence, where awareness of events did not translate into unified understanding or coordinated response. As maritime activity in the Caribbean continued to generate repeated patterns of disruption across different regions, the inability to consolidate intelligence into a coherent framework began to influence broader strategic interpretation within imperial administrations. Observers increasingly noted that similar outcomes were being reported across multiple independent sources, yet the absence of structural alignment prevented these observations from forming a single operational narrative. This gap between recognition and synthesis gradually shifted the focus of analysis away from isolated incidents and toward the systems responsible for processing them. Over time, this structural failure did not remain confined to intelligence channels alone, but began to affect the timing and coordination of broader strategic considerations as decisions were made on the basis of incomplete or partially reconciled information. The inability to establish a unified operational picture meant that responses were often shaped by fragmented interpretations of events rather than a comprehensive understanding of their underlying patterns. In this environment, the effectiveness of imperial awareness was no longer determined by the quantity of information available, but by its capacity to be aligned across systems that were no longer functioning in synchronization. Discrepancies continued to accumulate without resolution, and the distinction between fragmented observation and actionable intelligence began to collapse, creating conditions in which awareness of maritime instability no longer guaranteed the ability to interpret or respond to it effectively. What remained was a widening disconnect between perception and comprehension, where the same events were simultaneously visible and unreadable within the structures meant to contain them. In response to this mounting uncertainty, imperial administrations began shifting from fragmented analysis toward coordinated maritime action, preparing to engage the disturbances across the Caribbean through direct and sustained intervention. Spain's unrelenting hunt. Accounts filtering through disconnected colonial offices and maritime stations in the Caribbean began to converge into patterns that officials in Spain could no longer interpret as isolated irregularities. What had once been dismissed as fragmented reports from distant waters gradually accumulated into a consistency that suggested an ongoing disruption affecting shipping routes, coastal movements, and the stability of regional control. The concern did not emerge from a single catastrophic event, but from repetition across time, where similar descriptions appeared in unrelated correspondence, creating an uncomfortable sense that the problem was neither new nor temporary. This accumulation of fragments did not yet produce clarity, but it reduced the space in which uncertainty could be comfortably maintained, forcing attention toward patterns that resisted dismissal. Naval commands issued under increasing concern authorized early reconnaissance and intervention efforts, sending limited forces into poorly defined waters where reported disruptions were believed to originate. These initial operations were not yet full campaigns, but they reflected a shift in posture from passive monitoring to active engagement, as maritime authorities attempted to confirm whether the disturbances represented piracy, environmental miscalculation, or something less easily categorized. The difficulty lay not only in locating the source of disruption, but in determining whether it maintained a fixed presence at all, or whether it moved in response to external pressure in ways that made direct confrontation unreliable. Each attempt to clarify the situation introduced new ambiguity, as the act of observation itself failed to stabilize the conditions being observed. Attempts to establish reliable positioning around the contested island repeatedly failed, as shifting coastal conditions and inconsistent maritime markers prevented stable mapping or sustained occupation. Charts produced from different voyages often contradicted one another, not necessarily because they were inaccurate in isolation, but because the conditions they recorded did not remain consistent long enough to produce a unified representation. The shoreline itself, difficult to approach and irregular in its navigational references, resisted the kind of precision required for sustained military control, turning what appeared to be a geographic target into a moving problem of verification. In practical terms, geography no longer behaved as a fixed reference point, but as a variable that altered the reliability of every attempt to define it. Military responses unfolded in uneven cycles, where temporary incursions were followed by partial withdrawal, only for new directives to demand renewed engagement with the same unresolved zone. Each return brought increased preparation and revised expectations, yet the outcomes remained largely unchanged, as the conditions that undermined earlier efforts persisted regardless of scale or intent. Over time, these repeated cycles began to form their own pattern, not of resolution, but of return to the same unresolved state, where intervention itself became part of the instability it was meant to eliminate. What was intended as correction increasingly functioned as confirmation that the underlying problem could not be resolved through repetition alone. Groups operating within the island's influence adapted quickly to each new wave of external pressure, altering movement patterns and survival strategies in response to intermittent disruption. Their ability to adjust without centralized coordination allowed them to remain present even as outside forces attempted to suppress or displace them, creating a dynamic where absence and return were not opposites, but alternating conditions of the same existence. Rather than disappearing under pressure, they reorganized in ways that were not always visible to external observers, maintaining continuity through flexibility rather than permanence. This adaptability introduced a further complication for imperial planning, as every disruption produced a new configuration rather than a definitive outcome. Even as coordinated efforts intensified and resources were increased, the overall outcome remained unchanged, with each intervention dissolving into conditions similar to those that preceded it. The persistence of instability despite escalating force created a growing sense of contradiction within imperial planning, where greater investment produced only temporary effects that failed to alter the underlying situation. Reports began to reflect this tension indirectly, noting not only what was encountered, but what repeatedly re-emerged after each attempt to suppress it, as if the region itself retained a structural resistance to sustained control. Over time, the problem ceased to be framed as a lack of effort, and began to be understood as a mismatch between method and condition. Repeated failures to establish control forced a reassessment of strategy, narrowing attention toward figures whose actions were increasingly linked to the outcomes unfolding across the region. What had once been interpreted as a problem of geography or maritime disorder began to shift toward a more targeted understanding, where influence appeared to concentrate in specific actors rather than in the environment alone. This transition marked a subtle but important change in approach, as attention moved away from the island as an isolated source of disruption and toward individuals whose presence seemed to shape how each encounter developed. The focus of inquiry began to migrate from place to agency, from location to pattern of behavior. In this gradual narrowing of focus, imperial concern began to move beyond broad suppression efforts and toward identifying the mechanisms through which resistance was sustained despite repeated disruption. The uncertainty that once surrounded the island now extended into questions of coordination, leadership and adaptation, as repeated encounters suggested a level of coherence that could not be fully explained by chance alone. Even without clear identification, the pattern of outcomes began to imply that certain figures were consistently present within the shifting dynamics of control and resistance, shaping conditions without being fully contained by them. What emerged was not a conclusion, but a refinement of uncertainty into a more focused form. What followed was not an immediate resolution, but a change in interpretive priority, where understanding the nature of influence became as important as attempting to suppress its effects. This shift did not eliminate earlier failures, but reframed them, suggesting that each unsuccessful attempt had been engaging not with a fixed location, but with a moving network of decisions and actions that could not be addressed through conventional means alone. In this context, the problem was no longer simply where disruption occurred, but who appeared to be consistently present when it did. The question itself began to reshape the direction of imperial attention, narrowing the field of uncertainty into identifiable patterns of recurrence. Repeated failures to establish control forced a reassessment of strategy, shifting analytical focus from individual actors to the structural conditions shaping how authority weakened across distance. The cost of distance. Between the centres of imperial decision-making and the Caribbean zones where those decisions were meant to take effect, there existed a spatial separation that gradually transformed into a structural condition shaping the limits of authority itself. Information crossing this expanse did not arrive as a direct reflection of reality, but as a sequence of progressively altered interpretations, each shaped by the time it took to move across administrative and oceanic layers. By the time it reached its destination, what had once been immediate observation had already become a historical record of a situation that no longer existed in the same form. Transmission routes connecting colonial stations to European command centres operated through multiple intermediary stages, each introducing subtle shifts in meaning as reports were copied, summarized, or reformatted according to local administrative conventions. These transformations were not errors in isolation, but cumulative effects of systems designed for stability rather than speed, producing a steady divergence between original events and their final recorded form. As a result, authority relied not on direct perception, but on reconstructed versions of events assembled long after their conditions had changed. Within Caribbean operational zones, commanders and naval officers developed parallel methods of interpretation that prioritized immediate conditions over delayed instruction, since waiting for confirmation from distant authorities often meant responding to situations that had already evolved beyond their original parameters. This reliance on situational judgment did not represent a breakdown in hierarchy, but a necessary adaptation to temporal misalignment between instruction and environment. Each localized adjustment, however, further separated execution from intent, introducing variations that accumulated across successive operational cycles. Communication networks attempting to maintain coherence across this distance expanded in volume but not in clarity, as increased correspondence produced a greater density of outdated information without resolving the underlying delay. Reports circulated more frequently, yet each cycle reinforced the same temporal gap, where decisions were always reacting to conditions that had already shifted. The system grew more connected in structure, but less synchronized in function, creating an environment where coordination depended increasingly on inference rather than direct alignment. Naval movements across the Caribbean reflected this growing desynchronization, as ships operated under directives that often no longer corresponded to current maritime realities by the time they were executed. Adjustments made in the field were necessary for survival and operational continuity, but they also introduced deviations from centralized planning that were later recorded as inconsistencies rather than adaptations. Over time, these deviations accumulated into patterns that could not be reconciled within the original framework of command. At the administrative level, attempts to restore synchronization through stricter reporting protocols and expanded communication channels did little to resolve the fundamental issue, as the problem was not absence of information but its delayed relevance. Each corrective measure increased the flow of data without reducing the temporal gap between observation and instruction. The result was an expanding archive of partially obsolete intelligence that preserved awareness of events without restoring the ability to influence them in real time. In regions where maritime activity shifted rapidly, this temporal disconnect became especially pronounced, as environmental and operational conditions evolved faster than administrative responses could be formulated. Local actors adjusted continuously to these changes, relying on direct engagement with conditions rather than waiting for confirmation from distant authority structures. This practical autonomy did not replace imperial control, but it steadily weakened its capacity to shape immediate outcomes in the field. As these processes continued, the distinction between directive authority and operational execution began to dissolve, not through formal restructuring but through repeated divergence in practice. Instructions still existed and were still transmitted, yet their influence increasingly depended on whether they arrived within a timeframe compatible with the conditions they sought to regulate. Authority, therefore, became conditional on timing rather than position within the hierarchy. By the stage at which these structural delays were fully recognized within administrative assessments, they had already been absorbed into the operational reality of Caribbean governance, where decision-making increasingly occurred in response to local conditions rather than centralized instruction. The Atlantic no longer functioned as a simple distance between command and execution, but as an active temporal barrier that continuously reshaped the effectiveness of control. In practical terms, governance persisted as a formal structure, yet its capacity to reliably shape events diminished as delayed instruction became increasingly disconnected from the conditions it was meant to influence. Each layer of the system remained operational, but the alignment between them had become inconsistent enough to alter outcomes without requiring formal breakdown. Attention gradually shifted away from systemic failure and toward the figures whose actions consistently shaped outcomes despite the absence of reliable coordination. The rise of Henry Morgan's influence. Archival fragments compiled across colonial administrations began revealing inconsistencies in how certain maritime disruptions were being attributed to isolated causes rather than recurring operational patterns. What appeared in earlier correspondence as scattered incidents of piracy or misfortune gradually took on a more coherent shape, when reviewed across multiple jurisdictions, where similar descriptions of coordinated raids, intercepted vessels, and unexpected tactical precision appeared in unrelated reports. The issue was not a lack of information, but the inability of any single administrative channel to assemble it into a unified interpretation, leaving a fragmented record that hinted at underlying coordination without clearly defining its source. Over time, this fragmentation itself became meaningful, as repetition across separate archives began to function as a substitute for direct confirmation. Royal commissions issued during periods of imperial conflict established a legal framework that allowed privately armed vessels to operate under state authority while targeting enemy commerce across contested waters. This system of privateering, recognised by European powers during wartime, created an environment where maritime violence could be simultaneously sanctioned and strategically useful, yet difficult to regulate once deployed across distant theatres like the Caribbean. Captains holding such commissions were expected to operate within defined constraints, but the distance between European courts and Caribbean waters often transformed those constraints into flexible interpretations, where enforcement depended heavily on circumstance, communication delays, and local authority structures that varied significantly between colonies. In practice, legality became less a fixed condition and more a shifting boundary negotiated through distance and opportunity. Correspondence between governors and naval officials increasingly contained repeated references to a single, commanding presence whose involvement appeared across multiple independent reports of maritime engagement. These references did not always align in detail, yet they consistently pointed toward a figure associated with coordinated action, rapid execution, and an ability to operate across multiple zones of activity without remaining fixed to any single location. Over time, the repetition of such references created a documentary pattern that stood out not because of certainty, but because of its recurrence across otherwise unrelated sources, suggesting that the same influence was being encountered under different conditions and from different perspectives. The persistence of this pattern began to outweigh the uncertainty of its attribution, gradually shaping how officials interpreted otherwise disconnected events. Recorded movements attributed to coordinated raids and maritime incursions began extending beyond expected defensive boundaries, challenging established assumptions about the limits of authorized privateering activity. Operations that were initially understood as localized engagements increasingly demonstrated reach and timing that exceeded typical expectations for independent captains acting under loosely defined commissions. This expansion did not necessarily indicate a centralized command structure, but it did suggest a level of coordination or consistency in execution that complicated efforts to categorize such actions within existing legal or military frameworks. As a result, classification itself became unstable, with the same actions being interpreted differently depending on jurisdiction, observer, and political interest. Descriptions circulating through maritime intelligence networks gradually redefined Tortuga's significance, linking it less to simple refuge and more to a centre associated with organised and strategic violence at sea. What had previously been treated as a marginal island used by displaced sailors and opportunistic traders was increasingly described in reports as a point of coordination where ships were resupplied, crews reorganised, and plans for maritime operations took shape before being executed across wider Caribbean routes. This shift in perception did not emerge from a single discovery, but from accumulated observation, where repeated encounters with similar operational outcomes began to reshape how the island itself was interpreted within imperial awareness. The island was no longer only a location within the system, but a factor that appeared to influence the system's behaviour. Legal distinctions between sanctioned privateering and unsanctioned piracy became increasingly difficult to maintain in official records as overlapping behaviours blurred the boundaries between authority and autonomy. Ships operating under legitimate commissions were sometimes indistinguishable in practice from those engaged in outright maritime predation, especially when viewed from the perspective of targeted vessels rather than issuing authorities. This ambiguity was not merely theoretical, but operational, affecting how captured ships were classified, how prisoners were treated, and how incidents were recorded in administrative systems that struggled to maintain clarity under rapidly shifting conditions at sea. Over time, classification systems designed to impose order began reflecting the instability they were meant to resolve. Within this evolving landscape, the accumulation of references to a single, influential presence began to stand out not as anecdotal repetition, but as a structural feature of maritime reporting. The figure associated with these accounts was not always described in identical terms, yet the consistency of involvement across multiple engagements suggested a level of continuity that transcended individual incidents. Whether through direct command, participation, or strategic association, the same presence appeared repeatedly within the documentary record, forming a pattern that increasingly shaped how broader operations were understood. In this way, influence itself became something that could be traced through repetition rather than isolated confirmation, transforming interpretation into a process of pattern recognition rather than direct verification. As maritime conflict intensified and the boundaries between authorized and unauthorized action continued to erode, attention began to shift from categorizing events toward identifying the recurring forces behind them. The emphasis in official analysis moved gradually away from isolated incidents and toward the recognition that certain outcomes consistently appeared connected to specific operational patterns, even when the details surrounding those patterns remained incomplete. This transition marked a subtle but important change in imperial understanding, where the focus was no longer solely on what had happened, but on what repeatedly appeared to make it happen. Interpretation increasingly depended on recurrence rather than certainty, with repetition functioning as a proxy for understanding. The increasing concentration of influence within a single operational pattern began reshaping how entire maritime regions were understood, setting the stage for the island's transformation into a strategic instrument of conflict, the island that became a weapon. Strategic assessments compiled by colonial military observers began reclassifying certain Caribbean locations not as static territories, but as functional spaces within ongoing maritime conflict systems. What had once been described in earlier records as isolated points of refuge or disruption was increasingly interpreted through a different lens, one shaped by the logic of sustained conflict rather than geography alone. In this framework, the value of a location was no longer defined by what it contained permanently, but by what it enabled temporarily within wider operational movement across the sea. This shift in interpretation did not happen abruptly, but emerged gradually as repeated failures to contain maritime disruptions forced officials to reconsider the assumptions that had long shaped their understanding of control in the region. Geography, once treated as fixed and reliable, began to be understood as conditional, depending on how it was used rather than what it simply was. Coastal settlements under Spanish control across the Caribbean began experiencing recurring disruptions that reflected coordinated pressure originating from multiple maritime directions rather than isolated incidents. Ships arriving from different patrol zones reported similar patterns of sudden raids, intercepted supply lines, and rapid withdrawal before sustained engagement could be established. These events did not conform to the expectations of conventional naval conflict, where engagements typically unfolded in predictable sequences, but instead suggested a form of pressure that relied on timing, dispersion, and the ability to strike without maintaining fixed positions long enough to be countered effectively. Over time, what initially appeared as unrelated disturbances began to resemble interconnected outcomes produced by consistent operational behavior across different parts of the region. The consistency of these reports, despite their geographic separation, gradually reduced the plausibility of coincidence as an explanatory framework. Maritime operations in the region increasingly depended on cycles of resupply, repair, and concealment that allowed vessels to maintain readiness despite sustained pressure from opposing forces. The ability to withdraw into temporary safe zones, restore damaged ships, and reorganize crews became as important as the engagements themselves, creating a rhythm of activity that blurred the distinction between active conflict and logistical recovery. Within this system, endurance was not determined solely by strength at sea, but by access to reliable points where operations could be reset without permanent exposure to enemy control. These logistical cycles were not centrally coordinated in any formal sense, yet they began to produce consistent patterns of repetition that shaped how movement and engagement unfolded across the wider maritime environment. What emerged was a form of continuity sustained not by permanence, but by repetition across shifting conditions. Within this shifting operational environment, one island repeatedly appeared in logistical patterns as a consistent point of return used for coordination, recovery, and redistribution of maritime resources. It was not formally recognised as a structured military base, yet its repeated appearance in operational reports suggested that it functioned as more than an incidental location. Ships that had been dispersed by conflict or damaged in engagement often re-emerged from the same general area after periods of absence, indicating that certain geographic points were being used repeatedly to sustain continuity in otherwise fragmented operations across the Caribbean. This repeated association did not require formal designation to become functionally significant, as repetition itself created a kind of operational identity for the location within maritime behaviour. Over time, the island's role was defined less by official recognition and more by observable recurrence within operational outcomes. Repeated attempts by imperial naval forces to disrupt these operational patterns resulted in temporary interference, but failed to produce lasting control over movement or coordination within the region. Patrols that succeeded in dispersing ships or interrupting activity in one instance often found that similar patterns reappeared elsewhere, sometimes within the same waters after only short intervals of absence. This cycle of disruption and reformation suggested that the underlying system was not dependent on any single fixed location, but on a distributed network of behaviour that could adapt to pressure by shifting rather than collapsing. Each intervention therefore became part of a repeating sequence in which disruption altered form but not function, producing outcomes that remained structurally similar despite escalating effort. Control, in this context, became reactive rather than decisive, constantly engaging with a system that reconstituted itself in altered form. Over time, the repetition of coordinated activity originating from the same geographic reference points transformed what had been environmental geography into a functional element of sustained maritime pressure. The sea routes, islands, and coastal approaches of the region were no longer interpreted solely as neutral terrain, but as components within an evolving system of movement and resistance. What emerged was not a single battlefront, but a layered structure of interaction where control was continually negotiated through repeated contact, withdrawal, and reappearance, each cycle reinforcing the persistence of the system rather than diminishing it. In this way, geography itself began to behave less like a passive backdrop and more like an active condition shaping the limits and possibilities of maritime conflict. The island at the centre of these patterns was no longer simply part of the map, it was part of the mechanism. Dependence on unstable coordination points eventually exposed internal fractures within the system itself, where competing interests and shifting alliances began undermining the very structure that sustained it. What had once functioned through loose alignment of purpose and necessity began to fragment under the weight of diverging priorities, especially as the demands placed on resources, timing and risk increased across repeated operations. Coordination that previously relied on informal consistency became increasingly difficult to maintain, as the same flexibility that enabled survival also created space for misalignment and tension. Over time, the system that had adapted so effectively to external pressure began to experience instability, generated from within, where the absence of formal structure allowed contradictions to accumulate without resolution. This internal strain did not immediately dismantle operations, but it steadily weakened their coherence. As these internal pressures intensified, the effectiveness of previously reliable operational patterns began to diminish, not through sudden collapse, but through gradual degradation of coordination and trust between participating elements. Actions that once aligned naturally with expected outcomes began to produce inconsistent results, forcing repeated recalibration of strategy and intent. This erosion did not immediately disrupt the overall system, but it introduced uncertainty into processes that had previously relied on predictability under conditions of external threat. In this environment, even successful operations carried the unintended consequence of revealing deeper structural vulnerabilities that could no longer be easily contained or ignored. The system remained active, but its internal logic had begun to lose stability. What followed was not an immediate breakdown, but a progressive exposure of instability that had been masked by earlier success and adaptation. The same mechanisms that allowed sustained resistance against external forces now revealed limitations when subjected to prolonged internal strain. Coordination points that had once functioned as stabilizing elements began to reflect the tensions embedded within the system itself, turning functional advantage into structural weakness under continued pressure. This transformation marked a critical turning point where the sustainability of the system could no longer be assumed but had to be actively questioned. What appeared as strength from the outside increasingly revealed itself as conditional cohesion, sustained only under specific pressures. Dependence on unstable coordination points eventually exposed internal fractures within the system itself, where competing interests and shifting alliances began undermining the very structure that sustained it. Strain beneath the horizon. Operational continuity across the Tortuga network persisted outwardly without interruption, yet internal coordination began exhibiting subtle signs of strain that were not immediately reflected in outward performance. The appearance of stability remained intact across maritime activity, but the mechanisms sustaining that stability were increasingly dependent on compensatory adjustments that were not part of the original operational design. What had once functioned through predictable alignment now required continuous correction, suggesting that the system was no longer self-stabilizing, but actively maintained through effort distributed across multiple layers of activity. This created a condition where functionality and stability no longer described the same reality, even though both appeared present within the same framework of operations. Functional routines that had previously required minimal oversight started demanding repeated adjustments as timing inconsistencies emerged between connected groups operating under shared expectations. Coordination that once relied on implicit synchronization began requiring explicit recalibration, introducing delays that accumulated across sequential actions. These delays were not catastrophic in isolation, but their repetition altered the rhythm of operations in ways that gradually reduced efficiency across multiple channels. As a result, processes that had once appeared seamless began to reveal the effort required to maintain their continuity, exposing the hidden labor behind what had previously been assumed to function automatically. Resource allocation patterns gradually shifted away from predictable distribution cycles, revealing emerging imbalances that could not be corrected through established logistical procedures alone. Supplies and operational capacity no longer flowed evenly across all active zones, creating localized pressure points where demand began to exceed reliable replenishment. Attempts to correct these disparities often produced secondary imbalances elsewhere in the system, indicating that corrective measures were no longer neutral, but structurally consequential. Over time, redistribution became less a matter of optimization, and more an exercise in managing instability without fully resolving it. Independent operational segments began registering delays in mutual response behavior, suggesting that synchronization between previously aligned activities was no longer occurring at a stable rate. Signals that once moved through established pathways with minimal distortion now experience fragmentation as they pass through multiple layers of interpretation and execution. This introduced variability into responses that had previously been consistent, reducing predictability even when conditions remained unchanged. The growing gap between intention and execution became increasingly difficult to reconcile, as identical instructions began producing diverging outcomes depending on where and how they were processed. Decision pathways that once operated through implicit understanding required increasingly explicit verification, introducing friction into processes that had formerly relied on uninterrupted coordination. Where once shared experience allowed for rapid alignment, now each step required confirmation, adjustment, or reinterpretation before action could proceed. This shift slowed operational tempo and introduced cognitive and procedural load that accumulated across all levels of activity. The system did not stop functioning, but its efficiency diminished as trust in automatic alignment was gradually replaced by procedural caution. Pressure accumulated within transport and resupply channels, as repeated demands outpaced the system's ability to maintain consistent throughput across all active routes. Movement of goods, personnel, and operational materials became increasingly uneven, with certain routes absorbing disproportionate strain while others operated below capacity. This imbalance created cascading effects, where delays in one segment produced disruptions in others, amplifying instability without any single point of failure being responsible. The network began to behave less like an integrated system and more like a collection of interdependent bottlenecks. Environmental conditions alone could no longer account for the growing irregularities in operational rhythm, as internal dependency structures began to show signs of systemic fatigue. Patterns of disruption persisted even in the absence of external interference, suggesting that the source of instability was increasingly internal rather than situational. The system's own complexity had begun to generate conditions that exceeded its capacity for self-correction, turning structural interdependence into a source of vulnerability. What had once provided resilience through flexibility now contributed to instability through accumulated strain. Aggregated operational reviews began to reflect a shared but unspoken recognition that sustained expansion was no longer producing proportional stability within the existing framework. Increased activity, rather than reinforcing cohesion, was now revealing the limits of coordination under sustained pressure. The relationship between growth and stability had shifted, with each additional layer of operation introducing more variables than the system could reliably integrate. This emerging awareness did not yet alter behavior directly, but it changed how performance was interpreted at higher levels of oversight. Structural assessments conducted across multiple coordination layers indicated that the system's current state could no longer be described as a stable equilibrium, but had instead entered a phase of persistent internal imbalance. This conclusion emerged not from a single source of analysis, but from the convergence of multiple operational reviews that each independently identified similar patterns of degradation across communication, logistics, and coordination channels. What made the assessment significant was not any isolated failure, but the consistency with which instability appeared across unrelated functional areas, suggesting that the issue was no longer localized but systemic in nature. Even in areas where output still appeared stable on the surface, underlying processes revealed increasing dependency on corrective intervention to maintain continuity, indicating that equilibrium was being preserved artificially rather than naturally sustained. That imbalance, no longer contained within isolated functions, continued to deepen across interconnected operations, setting conditions that would soon redefine the entire structure from within: betrayals, fire, and collapse. Operational cohesion within Tortuga's maritime networks reached a threshold where continued function no longer depended on expansion, but on an increasingly fragile internal balance between competing priorities. What had once been a loosely aligned system sustained by necessity and repetition began operating under conditions where every adjustment introduced new instability rather than restoring equilibrium. Coordination no longer functioned as a reinforcing mechanism, but as a continuous negotiation between conflicting requirements, where maintaining one operational advantage often meant sacrificing another. Over time, the system stopped behaving like a coordinated structure and began resembling a collection of interdependent pressures that could no longer resolve themselves cleanly. Stability persisted only in appearance, held together by routines that still resembled order but no longer guaranteed predictable outcomes. What appeared as continuity was increasingly a surface effect masking deeper structural exhaustion. Previously aligned groups operating under shared necessity began pursuing divergent strategies as resource scarcity and shifting risk calculations altered long-standing patterns of cooperation. Decisions that had once followed established rhythms of mutual dependence increasingly reflected immediate survival logic, where short-term advantage outweighed any expectation of sustained alignment. The weakening of shared frameworks did not occur as a single rupture, but as a progressive divergence, where minor deviations accumulated until cooperation itself required constant recalibration. Each adjustment introduced new friction, and each compromise reduced the system's ability to return to its prior state of coordination. What emerged was not open conflict at first, but a quiet fragmentation of intent, where participants still operated within the same environment, but no longer within the same logic of action. The shared system persisted only in form, not in coherence. Imperial forces adjusted their maritime posture in response to observed instability, redirecting attention toward points where internal coordination appeared most vulnerable to disruption. Rather than relying solely on broad suppression efforts, strategic planning began to reflect a more selective understanding of structural weakness, focusing pressure on areas where alignment already showed signs of strain. This approach did not create the instability itself, but it accelerated processes already unfolding internally, turning latent fractures into visible points of failure. The system was no longer being challenged only from the outside. It was being shaped by the interaction between external pressure and internal divergence, where each side amplified the conditions produced by the other. In this environment, disruption became self-reinforcing, requiring less intervention to produce increasingly unstable outcomes. External action and internal weakening began to function as a single reinforcing loop. Communication failures and inconsistent execution across interconnected operations began undermining the reliability of coordinated action, fragmenting processes that had previously functioned through informal alignment rather than formal structure. Messages that once provided sufficient direction to sustain synchronized movement now carried delays, distortions, or partial interpretations that altered their intended effect by the time they were acted upon. As coordination weakened, localized decision-making replaced broader alignment, producing outcomes that were individually functional but collectively incoherent. The absence of unified timing meant that even successful actions failed to reinforce the larger system, instead contributing to a widening gap between intent and outcome. Over time, the structure did not collapse abruptly, but dissolved through repeated misalignment that gradually erased the conditions necessary for coordination to reform. Operational clarity gave way to procedural fragmentation. Conflicts that had once been directed outward against external targets increasingly manifested within the system itself, as mistrust altered the logic of cooperation and survival. The pressure of instability did not disappear but changed direction, moving from external engagement toward internal friction, where suspicion replaced coordination as the dominant organizing principle. Relationships that had previously depended on necessity began to fracture under the weight of uncertainty, as each participant recalculated risk in relation to others rather than in relation to external threats. In such conditions, cooperation no longer functioned as a stable framework but as a temporary alignment that could shift without warning. The system began to generate its own resistance internally, no longer requiring external opposition to sustain conflict-like behavior. Internal alignment itself became a contested resource. Incidents of destruction affecting key logistical points and maritime assets marked a turning stage in which instability transitioned from disruption into irreversible structural breakdown. These events did not operate as isolated catastrophes, but as cumulative expressions of a system already losing its capacity to maintain continuity under stress. The loss of infrastructure essential to repair, coordination, and resupply accelerated fragmentation, forcing remaining elements into increasingly isolated modes of operation. Each loss reduced the system's ability to recover from the next, creating a cascading effect where recovery mechanisms themselves became unreliable. Fire, whether accidental, strategic, or incidental in origin, became both a symptom and an accelerant of structural decay, signaling that stability was no longer being eroded but actively dismantled by conditions already in motion. Destruction ceased to be exceptional and became procedural. As logistical coherence weakened further, movement across the region became less predictable, not because activity ceased, but because it no longer followed consistent patterns that could be reliably interpreted. Ships, crews, and remaining operational groups continued to function, yet their interactions no longer formed a recognizable system of coordination. Instead, activity persisted in fragmented clusters, each responding to immediate conditions without contributing to a broader structure of control or continuity. What had once been a network of interdependent operations became a scattering of isolated responses, each shaped more by necessity than by shared design. The sense of an overarching system dissolved gradually, replaced by localized decisions that no longer accumulated into regional coherence. The sea routes themselves ceased to reflect any unified logic of movement. What followed was not an instantaneous collapse, but a prolonged erosion of the relationships that had once defined the system's identity. The disappearance of coordination did not eliminate activity, but it removed the framework that had allowed that activity to be interpreted as part of a unified structure. Without that framework, even repeated patterns no longer reinforced recognition of continuity, and the system ceased to be legible as a single operational entity. Instead, what remained was a dispersed field of residual behavior, where traces of earlier organization persisted only as isolated echoes of a structure that no longer existed in functional form. Interpretation itself became fragmented alongside the system it attempted to describe. What remained after the breakdown was no longer a functioning system, but scattered remnants of activity that persisted only as residual traces within a landscape no longer capable of sustaining its former patterns. Echoes beneath the silent shore. Residual references to Tortuga persisted in scattered maritime logs and colonial archives, despite the complete absence of any continuing operational activity in the region. What remained in these records was no longer a description of living systems or active movements, but instead isolated mentions embedded within unrelated entries, where the island appeared only as a reference point rather than a functioning part of any broader maritime structure. Over time, even these references grew increasingly detached from context, appearing as historical remnants that no longer corresponded to observable conditions at sea. The transformation did not occur as a clean break, but as a slow erosion of relevance, where each successive record carried slightly less certainty about what the name still represented. Within administrative archives, Tortuga gradually shifted from being a subject of concern to a residual notation that surfaced only when older documents were referenced, or when historical comparisons were required. Naval records that once tracked movement, engagement, and disruption across Caribbean waters transitioned into procedural documentation focused on other regions, leaving Tortuga as an incidental marker rather than an active point of interest. This absence of attention did not erase its past, but it did remove it from the framework of contemporary interpretation, where only active threats or functioning systems retained sustained documentation. In this way, the island's disappearance from operational records was not marked by deletion, but by displacement into historical background. Archived correspondence from naval and colonial authorities gradually ceased to describe any active engagements, leaving only indirect mentions embedded within unrelated administrative records. Reports that once detailed movement, conflict, and coordination across Caribbean waters transitioned into procedural documentation that no longer required reference to the island itself. Over time, even incidental mentions became rare, appearing only when historical context demanded comparison to earlier periods of maritime instability. The silence that followed was not immediate, but cumulative, forming through the steady absence of renewal in the documentary chain that once kept the island visible within institutional awareness. Oral accounts circulating among coastal communities across the Caribbean began preserving fragmented versions of events that no longer aligned consistently with official documentation. These narratives evolved independently of archival systems, shaped by transmission through ports, sailors, and coastal settlements where memory functioned as a flexible record rather than a fixed account. In some versions, the island retained its association with lawlessness and maritime disruption, while in others it was reduced to a distant reference point whose significance had blurred over time. The divergence between oral tradition and written record did not resolve into synthesis, but instead expanded into parallel interpretations that moved further apart with each generation of retelling. Cartographic references to Tortuga remained in circulation long after its strategic relevance had faded, retaining geographic presence without corresponding operational meaning. Maps continued to mark its position within the Caribbean archipelago, yet these depictions no longer implied control, activity, or strategic importance. The island existed in cartography as a fixed coordinate, unchanged in placement but emptied of function, preserved only as part of inherited mapping conventions. This persistence created a disconnect between representation and reality, where geography remained stable while meaning dissolved, leaving the island visible but no longer interpretable within any active system of use. Gaps within surviving archival materials increasingly drew attention from historians attempting to reconstruct sequences of events that no longer existed in continuous record form. These gaps were not uniform but scattered across different sources, creating a fragmented evidentiary field where continuity had to be inferred rather than observed. Attempts to reconstruct coherent timelines revealed not a single missing narrative, but multiple discontinuities that resisted alignment with one another. As a result, reconstruction became less an act of recovering lost history and more an exercise in interpreting absence, where what was missing shaped understanding as much as what remained. Competing interpretations of Tortuga's historical role emerged across different scholarly and maritime traditions, none of which fully reconciled with the fragmented nature of surviving evidence. Some interpretations emphasized its function as a temporary refuge within broader patterns of Caribbean conflict, while others framed it as a shifting operational space shaped by maritime pressures and adaptation. Yet each framework encountered limitations when confronted with inconsistencies in the record, where absence and contradiction coexisted without resolution. The island's history became layered rather than linear, with each interpretive model adding structure without achieving closure. Over time, the inability to consolidate these fragments into a unified account transformed Tortuga from a historical subject into a persistent example of archival limitation itself. Its significance came to rest not in what could be definitively stated, but in what consistently resisted confirmation across multiple forms of evidence. This shift altered its place within historical study, moving it from a reconstructed narrative into an unresolved case where interpretation remained permanently provisional. In this condition, the island existed less as a recovered history and more as an enduring boundary of what historical method could reliably recover. In the absence of complete records, Tortuga's presence endured through partial traces that continued to surface in unexpected contexts, suggesting that its historical footprint extended beyond the boundaries of any single archive or tradition. These traces did not converge into a unified account, but remained dispersed across time and documentation, appearing in ways that hinted at continuity without ever confirming it. Each fragment added to a growing sense that the island's history could be approached but never fully contained within a single explanatory framework, leaving interpretation perpetually open-ended. Tortuga is still recorded in fragments across maritime history as an island that once shaped Caribbean movement and conflict, yet whose full reality continues to evade complete historical reconstruction.